Welcome to the Rethink Leadership Podcast with me, Jeremy Blain. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Welcome to Michael Brabant PhD, my guest for today's Rethink Leadership Podcast. Michael is a seasoned expert in fostering psychologically safe environments that lead to authentic and lasting transformation within CEOs, leaders, and organisations. With his rich background in clinical psychology, leadership development, and integrative practices, Michael brings a unique, precise, and holistic approach to his consulting and coaching. His deep understanding and skillful facilitation of individual, relational, and collective dynamics allows him to guide leadership teams towards greater coherence, trust, and performance. While strategies are shared, the potency of Michael's work is in his ability to create contexts where people can reveal what is real, honest, and true. We discuss what embodied leadership is, how common it is in the workplace, and why it step changes how leaders lead for the better. We're proud to make this episode in aid of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, which has been at the forefront of animal rescue and protection since 1866. Find out more at aspca.org. Michael, welcome. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your view of leadership in organizations today.
I appreciate it. Really, my story is in service of everyone else's story. And I think that any good leader only speaks about themselves to the degree that it's relevant to someone else's transformation. So I won't go deep into my story other than I started in-depth psychology, getting my doctorate in clinical psych, and then realized there's a lot more to the human experience than just the psychological literature. So I was actually on a deep internal journey at the same time, so a deep sort of spiritual journey as I was getting my doctoral degree. And that only deterred me further away. And I was kind of doing the spiritual counseling, leading meditation retreats, leading healing ceremonies for about 7 or 8 years. But I had this degree, and then I found myself at an existential crossroads where my intuition just said, stop doing everything that you're doing and just wait. And as you know, in a fast-paced world, it is hard to drop everything you're doing and just wait for 5 minutes, let alone longer than that. But it didn't take that long to be kind of drawn into the business world. Started working with top sales performers and CEOs and sort of bringing the mindfulness and the depth psychology into that fold. And then realized that there's a lot of hurting people that have achieved a lot of really great things in the world and are feeling quite empty and continue to deepen. And I really bring that depth of psychology understanding, that depth of practical spirituality into the context of leaders that have so much influence and ability to help people. And I think to the second question around my view of leadership and organizations today, I really feel that there's a shallowness, not necessarily that it's not effective in the current paradigm of business and leadership. And I just feel the focus on externalities and just things outside of, I mean, culture is something that's brought into the fold, but in some ways it kind of feels like an afterthought. And oh, we need to have a good culture too, so we can hit our numbers and we can execute on our goals. But I really feel that there's a depth that's been missing. And could say that like leadership to me feels more focused on the more masculine side, the more doing, the providing, the making things happen, what's seen. And yet what brings fulfillment on the inside is what I experience as more of a feminine way, deeper listening, a deeper feeling and sensing, and more about the intangibles and the unseen. And so I feel that we're sort of leaning as a culture into this masculine, external, what is seen side, which can get a lot of results on the outside, but I don't know, your experience working with leaders, but I find when somebody has a dream unfulfilled or a goal unhit, there's a fantasy that says, oh, when I hit that, it's going to feel great. And when people hit all their goals and live all their fantasies and they still feel empty inside, that's when the existential crash comes. And I find that we can find meaning alongside creating value in the world and hitting outcomes. But oftentimes that's not the go-to. It takes people hitting a certain wall to be like, oh, maybe I can look something for something deeper as well as hitting the outcomes that I think I want. So I think we're sort of in a transition period of a lot of people waking up to that existential wall and finding ways to move through it in a good way.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And that I understand that superficiality that you're talking around as you can look at modern leadership today, particularly those businesses that have shareholders and how that can drive them forward, and all of these other bits that you mentioned as well there, Michael, about the culture. And this becomes an afterthought. Let's do this first and then we'll kind of figure that out, but it isn't fulfilling. And that link back to empathy, and you mentioned spirituality as well, is something we don't talk about in business. We don't use those words enough. We don't use the word love enough in business as well, let alone at leadership level. But all of these are human centered and humanity focused elements that employees and other stakeholders are demanding more of. So you kind of curate this and explain it as embodied leadership. Could you let us know what that means and how common it actually is in the workplace?
Hmm. Well, the paradoxical answer is that it's both extremely common and extremely uncommon. And I'll explain what I mean. I would say that embodied leadership is a congruence or a coherence between one's words, actions, and energy. And most people focus in that order. Well, I want to build a more conscious culture, so let me have a values exercise that brings everybody's voice in. That's great. We have some good things on the wall. We have some good shared values and beliefs. But when the actions don't match those because someone's under resourced, someone's stressed out, somebody got reminded of their father in a meeting and they suddenly find themselves at 8 years old in their brain, um, it becomes incongruent. And I think the subtlest level is the energy. And I see embodied leadership as an extension or an evolution from conscious leadership. So in some ways, we could say embodied leadership is embodied conscious leadership. And what I mean by embodied is that it's all the way through. And it's not about being perfect because a million times a day, our energy, words, and actions are not going to be fully coherent. But the question really is how fast as a leader can I be honest and humble and forthright about when I'm incoherent in my words, actions, and energy, such as, hey, you know what? I was really off this morning. I said this thing. It was out of line. It was kind of subtle, but it was out of line and disempowering and not who I want to be as a leader. I'm sorry. I'm really going to focus on being more aligned next meeting. So there's this notion of an apology, which I think is fairly rare in business. Oh, I'm sorry I did that. And then there's an amends, which is, I'm sorry I did that. And this is what I'm going to do differently so that I don't do that again. And as a leader, when we can be honest and vulnerable in that way, we actually humanize the whole office and culture because everybody is incoherent with their words, actions, and energy on a regular basis. And when it can be modeled by the leader, all of a sudden, anything the leader does, says, or emits becomes the cultural norm. And I find that the energy that one emits is actually more influential than the words someone speak. And there's a lot of people that can say the right thing, and we can just be like, God, I don't trust that person because it's not cellular, it's not all the way through. And so, going back to how common or uncommon it is, to the common part first, when we do something that's out of alignment with our energy or out of alignment with the person we know we want to be, the leader we want to be, our body registers it. Our body is just like, "Ugh." When we have that little dialogue in our head, it might be 2 seconds, it might be 10 seconds, we might be thinking about it for a couple of days. But then what happens after that dialogue of, oh my God, I said something, I messed up. I really need to, mitigate that. I need to go back and circle around. Then there's the rationalizer that comes in the head that's like, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. And what are they going to think if I say it that way? And what if I admit that I did something wrong? So the dialogue of the embodied leader, I think, is present in all leaders' minds. And that's the common part. How often does it escape the lips? And how often does it consistently escape the lips and become the foundation of the psychologically safe culture? I think it's extremely rare. And I hope it's less and less rare. And that's part of my journey to bring more of the human, honest element that everybody feels, but very few people speak into the open.
Well, we talk about coherence. You are very coherent, I must say, Michael, and around your explanations of this and the logic behind it, but also the very human part of it is obvious when you say it. And I think that it becomes obvious when people like you do say it because you are so genuine, you do put yourself out there. Few things that I like about that around that connection between words, actions, and energy. We don't often use that word energy in business or acknowledge it in some ways. And I believe that is really important in that embodied leader to be more conscious, more intentional, more coherent, more honest, more me, more the person as you were articulating there. The other element, which is a really great point that for me I get it immediately, but it's not an obvious one when I'm thinking about this myself, is that apology plus amends. It's often just the apology that you see. It's rare in my experience, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, that then we see in the workplace senior leaders, let's say, apology, say, I didn't mean to do that, and here's what I'm going to do about that now, so it doesn't happen again, or so I can correct it. Um, but then that links quite nicely to your both common and uncommon, and that the in my simple brain way of doing it, the common way that we all acknowledge it is the internal part. The uncommon bit is that externalization of that and the movement towards an action and energy behind it, I guess. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And I love what you're saying. And I think that this is the thing that what I'm saying and what I bring, it's obvious, but in some ways it's counterintuitive to the conventional culture. They aren't conversations that are regularly occurring, but as soon as it's named, it's like, oh God, I do that all the time. And I think that's the issue. It's almost like a blind spot, but it's so obvious when we can name it, when some leader can have the courage to be it, all of a sudden it creates relief inside of everyone's body because it's a universal experience. And I think being able to have the courage to be real in that way is oftentimes it falls into this bucket I find where people's imposter syndrome demon in their head comes up and it's like, well, if I'm honest or if I'm vulnerable, then people are going to think I'm weak. And that's an interesting belief because my experience is that when somebody is honest or vulnerable and they don't shroud it, they just own it, it's actually very, very strong. Because especially when someone's owning something that most people keep to themselves on the inside, when that person has the bravery to just name and own this universal human experience, all of a sudden, everyone who has fear to do that suddenly respects that person's courage and bravery more. And then it becomes this invitation, like, maybe I could do that too. And I think what's interesting about the work-life balance is we often think of like work as distinct from life. And I think the work-life balance is actually a little bit of a misunderstanding because to be a congruent leader, I have to be who I am here on this podcast, when I'm with my dog, when I'm having dinner with my wife, when I'm at work. And that's what allows me to feel peace. And this compartmentalization that's been normalized of who I am at work and who I am at home is what creates that tension in all of our psyches that has, oh, I can't say that at work. What do you mean? You can't be who you actually are at work? Are you at the right work? Do you want to be at a place where you can't be yourself? Is that actually what's keeping you A, from feeling happy, and B, from expressing the genius that you have inside of you that would contribute to a collective goal at work? So I think I just really want to kind of, rethink leadership, in the context of your podcast, but really have a new paradigm that's really an old paradigm that helps people really see, oh yeah, this is how it is. Why can't we just be like that? And those are the kind of conversations I like having.
Yeah, and it links back to me as you're talking to the fact that you're owning it and then you're doing it. It fills up that energy bucket for yourself and for others. And it almost gives that permission for the other people to do it, as you're saying. And the problem we have in business is there's so much unsaid or undone on this, and we can be, particularly in large corporates, it's fair to say, different. We might wear a mask, sometimes we might not. I think those of us that are more experienced and probably more comfortable in our own skin these days, and so on, but you still get caught out within that.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because what you're saying links to um, what is becoming more and more important in organizations where we're trying to break down those barriers between traditional leadership, management, and the rest of the organization, because we've all got to take part and all got to contribute to what we're trying to achieve. Because the speed of change, you talked about the speed of change, the speed of digital means that one leader can't do it on their own. One leader is simply not enough. But organizations must be psychologically safe to be able to pull that off. But if leaders and managers don't practice that, then that can crash and burn. It can destroy the culture. People disengage. And you're right, the energy gets sucked from the organization. So, how do you link an embodied leader, if you like, with psychological safety? And how important is that in the overall arsenal of a leader today, in the broader management that they have internally and in allowing employees to be themselves and contribute to the whole, not just their role?
Yeah, well, again, I think what you said before around when a company has stakeholders and external funding, it's tricky because the board, who are often the ones that are providing the funding, have very specific metrics that they need to see the company hit, such as what's your Q2 goal and did you hit it or did you not? And I find that the CEOs that I work with that are often in the tech industry that have taken external funding to the tune of multiple tens of millions of dollars, the level of stress that they're under because they know they need to create safety for people to perform to hit the metrics, but they don't have the time and they don't often have the mentorship from the people that are holding them accountable to the metrics to help them be a well-rounded leader that actually gets the number in a good way. And I find that people and companies can hit big numbers over the short term with grind and grit. But as you know, if somebody invests $40 million into a company, they don't want them to perform for 1 quarter or 4 quarters. They want year over year growth. And that kind of stabilized, sustainable, consistent growth cannot happen through grind and grit. Um, and I also find that if the center of gravity of the culture is grind and grit, it's going to attract grind and grit oriented people. So they might get to a place where they can be successful from a sheet perspective, like in the red or in the black perspective. But again, I think that, like you said earlier, people are waking up to wanting more, especially earlier, especially more recent generations. There's a higher standard than just financial success, and it's throwing a wrench in this conventional business culture. And I do think that eventually that's going to continue to expand and business culture at large will have to take its cues from that to become relevant and to retain really up and coming talent. Um, but I think that psychological safety as a fulcrum inside of this conversation is so essential because psychological safety, I would say, allows people to be human, but also allows innovation. So, at the changing pace of AI and the evolution of how business is done, we need to keep up with the evolution of the times. And in order to innovate, we have to threaten conventionality. But to threaten conventionality, we need to feel safe enough that when we share our truth, we're not going to be fired or prevented from upward mobility in the company. And so there's this paradox here. If it's not psychologically safe, we're going to have at least one hand tied behind our back because we won't be able to say that thing. And usually the thing we're most scared to say that challenges the status quo becomes the seed for the innovation required for the company to continue to be an innovator and rise with the times of change. So I find that a CEO, if the CEO can start to be this, it's going to start to cascade into the leadership team. And then if the leadership team starts to do that, it can start to cascade into the rest of the company. But I find that if the CEO is not on board, the CEO's unconsciousness and insecurity will be the governor or the braking system that will keep that culture from growing and innovating as much as it could. So that's why that internal validation of the CEO, the psychological safety inside the CEO's head, needs to be the first psychological safety before they can consistently bring it to the culture at large.
Yeah, and I recognize that. I see that time and time again where it starts and fails at the very top. The leadership or management mindset is not there as a collective, but then you've got a group of individuals. So it's all very well saying, right, everybody does this, but to your point, we've all got the different angst that we're dealing with in our own psychological safety, and then how we externalize that is something else, depending on
Mhm.
how we view our career, our progression, or whatever it is. And there is a cost though, because it feels like we're in an era where employees have more power than ever in terms of choice, alternatives, becoming independent workers, giggers, whatever it is, without necessarily having a career for life that some of these leaders that we're talking about have grown up with. So there's a mismatch there, and that's a real risk for them. But and that in itself, regardless of what you talked about innovation, we have to threaten that conventionality as well, about how we used to do things is maybe 20th century mindset. What does the 21st century mindset mean, whereby we can start to shift some of these things? Um, it does occur to me then, Michael, that to get this right, there's quite a lot of moving parts to get this right. We've got the individuals, we've got the collective at certain levels, we've got the organization, stakeholders, shareholders, you name it. Are there any examples of companies or leaders out there that you've worked with that are getting this right and that really embrace what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, well, I think that again, going back to what I see trending in leadership around this masculine and feminine, masculine is oriented towards outcome and feminine is oriented towards process. And I feel like I'm a pretty balanced man, between the masculine and feminine. And my wife has really shown me and led me how I get stuck in my mind in the outcome and not being present to the process. Because really, psychological safety is I'm present with myself, I'm present with what's happening in you and in the room, I'm present to the various timelines. And so, this notion of getting it right, I think, is of itself coming from this outcome orientation that is the conventionality that we're speaking about. And so, for me, I see a lot of the leaders that I work with are very much in the process of getting this more and more right. Um, because, what happens if you and I are in a conversation or we're in a relationship in business for 10 years and we just keep it superficial. And then one day, maybe we have a little too many drinks and we like get a little bit deeper. And then the next day, it's like, oh my God, did we just deepen the relationship? Like now what can we go back to talking on the surface or is this the new thing? So every time the leader takes a risk to make a cultural change through their own leadership of, I'm going to own a mistake. I'm going to make an amends. I'm going to do something that's out of the ordinary. All of a sudden, that kicks up a whole layer of experience that previously wasn't invited. And then everybody has to acclimate to that. And and then once everybody acclimates to that, and then we take another step, and then it shakes everything up again. We have to acclimate to that. And then as we acclimate to these deeper levels of truth and depth and honesty, we're probably going to have to look at how we run our business and the policies and the cultural values and the people that we choose to work with and partner with and our hiring practices and our onboarding practices. So I find that it's actually an evolutionary process that CEOs go through that. And usually, in business, what's so great about business is we can see how effective things are quite quickly. Does this help us hit our goals? Does this increase client retention? Can we have faster decision making? Are our meetings more alive and useful, or are they still boring and everybody's looking at their watch? So we can see if something that we do, an injunction, is effective. And if we do some of these injunctions that are effective that I'm speaking about, in theory at least, then we'll probably want to do more. Well, that really worked well. Or wow, we closed that deal. We didn't think we dropped the sales cycle 50% of the time. How do we do that? Let's do more of that. But every time we do more of that, it's going to bring up deeper insecurities inside of the leader. It's going to bring up more unspoken things. When it's more safe, there's more data on the table. And usually that means decisions can be made better because more people are bringing their genius forward. But at the same time, it's an ongoing process. So it's more of like, is a leader committed to the ongoing process of evolution and ongoing deepening of psychological safety? There is no end. There are ways in which people are like, that's enough. I feel like we've, been honest enough, But I think for the most part, once people get a taste of this, my experience is they're like, want more. And then the people want more. And so it's not a matter of more is better, but it's just more helps to, if you put a watermelon in a box like they do sometimes in Japan, it's going to turn into a square watermelon. But if you let a watermelon grow in the wild, it's going to get bigger, it's going to have different colors, it's going to be expansive. So really what we're doing is taking the box out of the growth process and seeing where it wants to move. And every group of people are different and they're going to grow in a different shape. And so I think that everybody that I work with is a conscious moving to an embodied leader. But how that evolution works is built on a lot of factors and a lot of lines. But when the motivation is there and the vision is there from the CEO, sky's the limit.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that does take from those more enlightened CEOs or senior leaders a dose of vulnerability, quite a lot of courage
Yeah.
to let that grow more organically, let's say. And maybe that is that mix of male and female orientation that links task and outcomes to process and people that builds that whole harmonious process, or not process, or cycle, if you like,
Yeah, totally.
together. Although there's no right or wrong way, I'm sure, of doing that. You started to talk about what we can do there. So for those tuning in that have been captivated like I have with this conversation, what would be your top three pieces of advice for how to make progress in this area in growing the awareness of ourselves, that internal, to help collaborate and grow others, to help the business do something different as true embodied leaders?
Mhm. Just three, huh? I want to keep it practical. But again, I want to just there's this very beautiful Zen saying that says the path cannot be taught, it can only be taken. And I say that in the context of what I'm about to share here because it's really a journey of willingness, a willingness to move into the unknown. And the unknown is something that the greatest explorers, of our human history, if we had just kind of stayed on the map and with the known, we wouldn't have gotten very far. We wouldn't have discovered a lot of things. I'm not talking about colonialism, imperialism, and the negatives of that, but just the notion of, hey, I don't know what's on the other side of this ridge. but I'm going to find out. And I think that kind of willingness is a really important precursor to what I'm going to say in terms of applying, because we can't step on a new shore as one foot's on the previous one. So we have to have enough courage and enough willingness and enough trust of our intuition to start taking a leap of faith. And I think there's also a lot of ways that we can take baby steps that aren't too scary, because I think change is something that we need to do gradually in order for it to be sustainable. But I would say the first thing is, leaders are in a positional hierarchy where they sign people's checks, and there's an inherent power dynamic within that it's scary for people to challenge someone who signs their checks, metaphorically or literally. And there's a way in which that leader can unconsciously leverage that positional authority to not actually be as available to feedback as they say they are. This is the difference between the mind energy and or the thoughts energy and action. So I find that the first step is internal validation, to recognize how am I unconsciously or subconsciously leveraging my positional authority to not look at my insecurity and expecting people to agree with me, because parts of me are insecure when people don't agree with me. And so when I can look and see what are the things that parts of me are expecting other people to give me so that I feel okay. Self-esteem is not an adjective, it's a verb. If I have high self-esteem, then I consistently esteem myself. But in business, we're so focused on the results and the external. If my company hits this number, then I'm going to be a good leader. If people don't go against my vision and don't question my authority, then I'm going to be a confident leader. But all that's conditional. But if I can internally validate and give myself the things parts of me seek from others, then my confidence will be unconditional. And then I can take feedback and I can not hit my goals and I can learn from it rather than trying to cover it up. So internal validation is key. I'd say the second one is to find people that really know you and that you can trust are really going to be honest with you to give you real feedback with candor. And this is not necessarily something to start in the context of your team. For me, the person that gives me the best feedback is my wife. We've set up a situation and I'm, completely imperfect at it, because when she gives me really good feedback, my first response isn't, "Oh, thank you so much, honey." It's usually like, "Oh, you see that? Oh," and so God bless her. Thank you so much for her courage to challenge me in that way. But the value of what she can see, and the feminine is such an asset. Um, Whether, I'm speaking about my wife, but I'm also speaking about just women are so sensitive. They sense things that men often can't. And yet, in a patriarchal society, there's a way in which it's not safe for them to be fully honest. And so I would say find people that can really tell you what's real and do your best to create a lot of safety for the women in your life, because they're going to sense things from a different angle than men in your life, I find. And so your spouse is usually the number one because they know you the best. Your kids are probably number two. They may not say it in the language that your spouse does or your leadership team does, but if you can really pay attention both to the implicit feedback you're getting from people, like how people kind of shut down, or when you ask anybody, is there anything else anybody has to say? And there's this pregnant silence. People's heads are shaking no, but there's this pregnant silence of like, there's some unspoken stuff here. So we have to really set up our observational capacities and our humility to be able to really receive the feedback that's real. And I would say lastly, for leaders to take risks in being before they start writing down lists of conscious values on the wall. When we say what we're going to do and we can't follow through, it actually breaks more trust. And I find that what I encourage leaders to do who want to like implement new programs and, well, let's bring you in and talk to the whole leadership team and let's change the culture. I say, let's slow down for a second. How about you just start quietly implementing everything that we're talking about and seeing how people respond to you? Because if people can walk away from a conversation and be like, God, I've never had a conversation with my boss like that before. What are they doing? Like they must be getting coaching or I don't know what's happening, but it felt great. That's such a better form of internal advertising than the CEO bringing in a consultant and being like, all right, we're going to change the culture. We're going to become more conscious. We're going to be a psychologically safe, company. And I just find that being it is so much more trustable than saying it. And once we've been being it for a while, getting the feedback, implementing things, being open, then when we say, hey, you might have noticed I'm making some changes, then it's so much more trustable and people can be like, wow, this is real, as opposed to, oh, this is just lip service again. And I wonder how long this is going to last. How many times have we brought in a consultant? People got really excited about the content and then it becomes an afterthought. What did they talk about last month? Oh, I don't know. We got a lot of stuff to do. Just focus on what we need to get done. Right. And so that change needs to really root in the leader for it to start to root into the culture.
Go back to something that you said really first off there. You have to have the will, you have to have that your mindset right, don't you, before going into this first, and then to really immerse in that journey. And those three steps, a wonderful way of making progress. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Hey, you're welcome.
Sadly, we've come to the end of our conversation, and I want to thank you for joining me. I'm sure those tuning in will want to connect with you, find out more. How do they do that?
Yeah, thank you. It was a lovely conversation. My website is candorandcoherence.com, which I'm sure Jeremy will put in the show notes. And on the homepage, you can sign up and receive a 5 email sequence around the 5 pathways of truly trustable leadership. So another way that I think about my work is creating truly trustable leaders. It's much more relatable than I think embodied leadership or even conscious leadership. So feel free to check out the site. There's more about the philosophy of how I approach consulting, but there's also a lot of free resources and also other conversations like this that people can check out and get a deeper sense of the philosophy that I'm coming from.
Such a thoughtful and insightful conversation. Dr. Michael Brabant, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership Podcast with me, Jeremy Blain. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.